Last week, Lex looked at and started a series called What's in the Egg. And for those of you who didn't see it, he was talking about, well, first of all, he learned a lesson that you should never work with animals and children. But he also took an egg that he'd had for, if I recall, 50 plus years that he'd held onto, a hollow egg. And he made the choice to smash that egg, that hollow egg that he'd put so much value into, and wanted to make that point that the things that we value, their outside, we value the shell of those things, that they're not worthwhile. They're not the things that we should put value in. I'm just going to change mics now. And so today, I'm going to continue our series of What's in the Egg by looking at the content. So I'm not going to answer what comes first, the chicken or the egg, but we're actually going to use a chicken's egg and look at that concept and draw some parallels between that a chicken's egg and our own lives. I've got some of Kath and Jeff's delicious eggs down here. We've been blessed with these for our family. We're going to have a look at this egg. We're going to see how the makeup of this egg, in its simplicity, is actually a powerful reminder of what makes up us as people and what makes up our lives. Today, I want to talk to you about a gift that we have, the gift of limitations. That's right, the gift of limitations. Now, before I head into it too much, this egg has limitations. Inside this egg is a yolk and a white. And while it's inside this shell, it's maintaining its purpose. If I smash this egg open, and I'm not because they're tasty, if I smash this egg open, you would find that maybe in the refrigerator, if I cracked it open, put it in a bowl, in the refrigerator, 2 to 4 days is the maximum amount of time that this egg would stay fresh. But inside the shell that it's in, within its limitations of this shell, it can last up to a month, even more so. But let's talk a little bit more about if I didn't just use this egg for cooking, that the limitations of this egg would still have a purpose. When this egg comes out of a chook, it has a purpose, but only if the chook has been fertilised. This is like a science lesson, it's great. So, and only if, within the limitations of the mother hen sitting on this, will this egg reach what its potential is meant to be. It has multiple purposes, we can say. It can either be a chicken. Things are going crazy here, folks, with the wind. It's hilarious. This egg can either be a chicken, or this egg can be something delicious to eat. But that's it. This egg will never be a dinosaur. This egg will never be a crocodile. And this egg will only last for me to eat if I keep within the bounds of its limitations. So, let's talk about limitations. We live in a world that shouts to us, you can be anything. There are no limits. And at first hearing, it seems to be an excellent dose of positive thinking to counter all the naysayers in our world. And in fact, the generations that are to come are told, you can be anything. But it's not true. It's enticing. It sounds liberating, but it's actually impossible. That chicken's egg, it is impossible for it to be anything but a chicken or something for me to eat. And do you know what I see unfolding if we continue to believe that anything is possible and that our life has no limits? I actually see the generations to come being worse off rather than better off. Even as a Christian community, we can take some of the verses in the Bible out of context to try and support our argument that there are no limits. There's the verse that says, and we plaster it on cute memes, with God, anything is possible. But when we take that thing that Jesus said out of context, we skew what it's meant to mean. Jesus is talking about that with man, things are impossible when it comes to salvation and making our own route to salvation. But then he follows up, but with God, nothing is impossible when it comes to the salvation of man. So if we start taking things out of context when it talks about limitations, we're messing with ourselves. So let's explore what I mean about the gift of limitations. You see, limitations are a bit like fat and stress. Limitations are a bit like fat and stress because there are good versions of them and there are bad versions. There is a good version of limitations, a good and godly version, and there is a bad, unhelpful, ungodly version of limitations. Let's think of it in these two ways. There can be limitations of design. They're the gift. And there's limitations of deception. Things that limit us by distracting us, deceiving us, derailing us from what we're called to do. Limitations of design are those things that God has designed in me and that God has designed for me. Limitations of deception are those things that distract me from what God is calling me to do. And in fact, limitations of the design are the things that I need to accept. Limitations of deception are the things I need to take off autopilot and actually address. And the gift hidden within the limitations of design is that once you accept them, you're actually free to work on your limitations of deception. Now, don't get me wrong, limitations of deception can actually look wise. They're clothed in worldly wisdom, and sometimes they're actually imposed by the world. Sometimes they're the result of our sin. Sometimes they're the temptation of the devil. And so I think it's really important that we look at those limitations that are by design in us and for us, and those that are designed to deceive and distract. I want to tell you a personal story, and I chuckled to myself because when Lex and I were talking about this series and what I would talk about today, he said, Amy, I want you to read this chapter in a book. I think you're going to find it revelational. And I chuckled as I read it because it's a really, really good content. But I felt like saying, Lex, I've been working on this for 20 years. You see, back when I was 10, I saw a documentary on Fred Hollows, and I decided I wanted to be an eye doctor. Right then and there. I'd figured that if God had given me the brains to learn and understand things, and I knew as a kid that things came quickly to me, then I wanted to use what I had, what God had designed in me, to benefit others. I didn't want to be doing something that didn't have a purpose or a meaning. And I chuckle to myself when I think about how my 10-year-old brain processed this. And that decision was made in a moment, and that drove some major decisions for the next 8 years. I was able to fast track my secondary studies. I worked hard in VCE, and I got into medicine at Melbourne University. And 6 months later, I quit. 6 months. I was depressed. I was anxious. I was exhausted. As I'd worked tirelessly to learn the content of the course in that 6 months, in the same way I learned what I needed to in VCE. I hadn't received and accepted the limitations that God had designed for how I should spend my time. He made it very clear in his creation of this world and in the creation of us that we are designed to rest. And I hadn't. I hadn't accepted that. And I was still doggedly waving that flag that I had picked up as a 10-year-old. Was my desire to become an eye doctor wrong? No, I don't believe it was. But was I pursuing it in line with God's limitations of design of me and my calling? Another no. I can tell you that I was working in my own strength. So folks, although there's the desires that God puts in our heart, if we don't work those desires out in a way that accepts the limitations of how God has designed us, then we're not walking in step with His will. I want to have a look at some people in the Bible that do a much better job of walking in the gift of limitations than perhaps some of us have. Last week, Lex talked about Jesus' friends, Mary and Martha, and the experience that Martha had in accepting what the world said was valuable rather than what Jesus was saying was valuable. Today, I want to look at John the Baptist, Jesus' cousin, older by 6 months, and the way that he represents the gift of limitation by what he was designed to do. So by family lineage, he was Jesus' cousin. And before he was born, it was declared by an angel of God that he was to be great in the sight of the Lord. He would bring back God's people to the Lord, and he was a messenger preparing the way for the Lord. They are big shoes to fill, but that was God's design for him. And then came the day when he actually submitted to Jesus as the Messiah. You see, John grew up, and then came the time that he started baptizing people, just like we saw a baptism today, baptizing people and calling them to repent, for the Messiah was coming. And then came the day where he actually was approached by Jesus. He was baptizing people in the river, and he knew it. He knew when he saw Jesus that the Messiah was here. And Jesus comes up to him and says, I want you to baptize me. And this messes with John's head, because he knows he is called to baptize God's people in preparation for the Messiah. But Jesus says, no, you need to baptize me so that they will know. And John is obedient. And that's the first part of what we hear about what's going on with John. And you can read this, it's really cool. It's in Luke 3, Matthew 3, and John 3. You can read about this, and then we hear about how after this, time passes. I love how the Bible says, and after that, and it could be days, months, years, and after that, we hear of another time. We step into the world of John the Baptist, and he's baptizing by one river, and his disciples are having, it says, a hearty debate with the people around. I reckon they're arguing with the Pharisees. And then they turn to John and they say, hey, that guy you baptized the other day, he's over the other side of the river baptizing people now. You said you were called to baptize people. And John puts them back in his place because he understands the limitation of design and the gift that it is. He says, great. Then I become less so that he becomes more. If John had only seen, I am called to baptize, and kept doing that and not understand the limitation of that, then he would have caused great confusion if he'd kept going. He would have delayed the ministry of Jesus if he'd not realized and accepted the limitation of the design for his life. Now let's also look at Jesus. While he is fully God, he is fully man. And he too, in his ministry, accepts the limitations by design of who he is and what he's called to be. You see, after Jesus gets baptized by John, the Spirit leads him out into the wilderness. And it's there that Satan tries to tempt him in 3 different ways. Tries to tempt him with giving into power, by turning any stone that he has to bread, because he's really hungry. He's been there for 40 days. And Jesus submits because of the limitations of what God's designed for him. He submits to God's timing and says, no, I won't do it. Then it talks about how Satan takes him up to the highest point and shows him all of the power that he can have and says, you can have this if you follow me. And Jesus says, no, I submit to the Father's will and his timing. And then he says to Jesus, you can skip. You are Almighty Messiah. You can skip all the suffering that is to come. You don't have to do that. And Jesus says, no, I submit to the will and the timing of God. And even so, we see in the way that Jesus does that he is willing to work within the limitations of design, of who he is and what he's called to do. And even in the 3 years that the Gospels talk about Jesus' ministry, we know that there was limitations. Jesus didn't heal every person that was sick and demon-possessed. Jesus didn't, he prayed all night and then chose 12 disciples. Just 12. He chose not to build a ministry in the city of Capernaum. And he also chose not to go beyond the regions with which he was born and raised. He didn't go to Europe and Africa and all of the world. He delegated within the limitations of the ministry that he had. You see, both John the Baptist and Jesus give us really good examples, godly examples of working within the limitation of the designs, the gift that is. So it's interesting to a degree to see that that's represented through Jesus and through John the Baptist. But you could ask, well, what's that mean for us today? What does it mean to accept the gift of limitation by design? Well, doing so means that it actually protects us from hurting ourselves, hurting others, and hurting God's work. If I had worked within the limitations of design, I would have protected myself from unwellness, from exhaustion. Accepting the gift of limitation by design means that it keeps us grounded. It keeps us humble. It breaks our self-will and puts us in line with the will of God. It provides direction if we're willing to listen. And through it, we can grow in wisdom and encounter God. So what does this mean? How do we do this? Well, I've talked a lot about making sure that we accept the limitation of the call that God's designed for us. But actually those limitations, just like that egg that I had, is limited by the content that it has. It will only grow a chicken's egg, a chicken from that egg. We too have limitations to who we are and how we're created. Think about this. What are the limits of my personality and my temperament? You see, I'm introverted. God calls me to do a stack of extroverted things. But if I don't understand that I'm introverted and that's my limitation, then I will be exhausted far quicker than if I take time out. I know that in my personality that God's created, that there's important things to do if I'm to walk in his will. And I ask you, what are the limits of your personality and your temperament that actually you need to accept? What are the limits of my current season of life or of your current season of life? At the moment, I live at Camp Coolamatong. We live on site and I oversee and care for and love and manage the interns. And that is a big part of what God's calling me to do. There are other things I do. I get joy from singing at church. I get joy from being able to put together things to talk about to you. But my season is limited. And accepting that means I stay in God's will. What are the limits of being married or being single? For me, the limits of being married means I love my husband first, I love my kids next, and then outpours with the rest of the energy that I have. What are the limits of my emotional or physical or intellectual capacities? And how does God use that? Here's an interesting one. What are the limits of my family of origin? And what are the limits of my time and my energy? I want to read you a story. And it's a challenging story because it could be taken the wrong way. It takes me a little bit to open it, sorry. This is a fable. And this fable is about a man who determines his purpose in life. He knows what he's designed to do. He has a place to go. Give me a second. If I was smart, I would have got this ready earlier. Here we go. Once upon a time, there lived a man who had given a great deal of thought and effort to determine what was the path for his life. And then one day, a door opened for him to actually pursue that. But the opportunity would be available only for a short time, and he'd have to go on a long journey. He began walking and grew more and more excited as he envisioned his future dream becoming a reality. He hurried along, and then he came to a bridge high over a dangerous river. Maybe a bit more dangerous than the one we've got here. There's a lot of rocks, though. As he started to cross the bridge, he noticed a stranger approaching him from the opposite direction. The man had a rope wrapped around him many times around his waist, and the rope looked like it might stretch to a length of about 10 metres. The stranger began to unwrap the rope as he walked towards the man, and just as the two men were about to meet, the stranger said, "Excuse me, sir, would you be so kind as to hold the end of this rope for me?" And without thinking, almost instinctively, the man reached out and took the rope. "Thank you," said the stranger. "Two hands now," he added, "and remember, hold tight." And at that point, the stranger jumped off the bridge. The strong pull from the now extended rope was so strong it almost dragged that man over the side of the bridge into the river below. He shouted over the railing, "What are you trying to do?" "Just hold tight," the stranger called back. This is ridiculous, the man thought. He began trying to haul the stranger up, but the task was beyond the strength that he had on his own. "Why did you do this?" he yelled in frustration over the edge to the man. "Remember," said the stranger, "if you let go, I will die." "I can't pull you up," the man cried. "I am your responsibility," said the stranger. "I didn't ask for it," said the man. "If you let go, I'm lost," repeated the stranger. The man began to look around for help, but no one was within sight. He began to think about his predicament, call it a little bit more than a predicament. Here he was, eagerly pursuing a unique opportunity to fulfill a dream. And now he was being sidetracked, distracted, derailed for who knows how long. Maybe I can tie the rope somewhere, he thought. He looked around the bridge carefully, but there was no way to get rid of his newfound burden. And again he yelled over the edge to the man, "What do you want?" "Just your help," said the stranger. "How can I help? I can't pull you in, and there's no place to tie the rope where I can find someone else who could help us." "Just keep hanging on," replied the dangling stranger. "My life is in your hands." The man was stumped. "If I let go, all my life I will always regret I let this stranger die. If I stay, I'll never reach my dreams or destiny. Either way, this is going to haunt me forever." Time passed and still no one came, and the man was keenly aware it was almost too late to start his journey again. If he didn't leave immediately, he wouldn't arrive in time. Finally, a new idea came to him. "Listen," he explained to the man hanging below. "I think I know how to save you." He couldn't pull the stranger up just by his own efforts. But if the stranger was going to shorten the rope by wrapping it around his waist while he was dangling, together they could actually do it. But the dangling man had no interest. "You mean you won't help?" he shouted to the stranger. "I can't hold on much longer." "If you don't, I will die," came the reply. At this moment, a revelation came to the man on the bridge, the idea until this moment he would never have considered. "Listen carefully," said the man. "I mean what I'm about to say." The dangling stranger looked up, hopeless and despondent. "I will not accept the position of choice for your life, only for my own. From this moment, I give the power of choice for your own life back to you." "What do you mean?" the stranger asked, clearly afraid. "I mean, it's up to you. You decide your future. I will be the counterweight. You do the pulling and bring yourself up. I will tug some from here." The man unwound the rope from around his waist, braced himself to be a counterweight. "You cannot mean what you say," the stranger shrieked. "You would not be so selfish. I am your responsibility. What could be so important that you'd let me die?" After a long silence, the man on the bridge said slowly, "I accept your choice." He let go of the rope and continued on his journey over the bridge. Now, that story can bring up a number of responses, but I want you to think of this. The burden that was the man over the bridge is not just a person. That burden can be the expectations that we hold on to that are a limitation by deception. The things we get distracted about that we hold on to that aren't in the will of God. That's the limitation of deception. And it's up to us, it's our choice to let go of that rope. Let go of the things that are deceiving us, that we can't just accept, that we don't want to just be on autopilot through our life. And that gives us the freedom, folks, to actually accept the limitations of the design that God has worked in us and for us. Now, I could go on for hours, but I'm not. I'm going to leave it there because I want you to remember this. The limitations of design are God-given. They're there to humble us and to keep us in the will of God. And they are a gift. And we get to choose it.